So you know what? To take this fight for Lowry, good on.
Picture this. The face of the National Hockey League, Connor McDavid of the Edmonton Oilers, flying down the ice at well over 20 miles per hour with the puck on his stick, looking to add another highlight reel goal to his collection. Then, suddenly, boom. He's caught with his head down by an opposing defenseman and is delivered an absolutely bone-crushing body check. To a person familiar with the game of hockey, you know what happens next. Someone on the Oilers is coming to fight whoever it was that threw that body check, even if it was a legal play. To someone that knows the game of hockey, you know exactly why this fight is happening. But what about the casual fan that has never seen something like this? How does one rationally explain a player having to fight for doing something within the rules? As a matter of fact, why the hell is fighting even allowed in hockey in the first place? Today, we're going to discuss not just why fighting is allowed in hockey, but also why it is an essential part of the game. When it comes to sports, few can match the speed and intensity of the game of ice hockey. Players buzzing around the ice at blazing speeds, pucks being shot by players occasionally over 100 miles per hour, sticks breaking and bodies crashing into each other. With all the chaos that takes place on the ice surface, it's easy to see how tensions can occasionally boil over. And when those tensions do boil over, fights break out. Most of the time, these fights happen because of something known by hockey players as the code. Essentially, the code states that if a player does something that is out of line, then they will have to answer for what they did. You hit Connor McDavid? Yeah, it's time to fight. And the player that threw the hit will almost always take the fight, no questions asked. This is just something that is expected of hockey players. Hockey players stand by their belief that fighting is actually something that can minimize the violence that takes place during a game. Because of fighting and adhering to the code, players typically think twice about throwing a dirty hit or engaging in another dangerous play. Forget the guys in the black and white stripes. Hockey players are their own referees, and it's been like this for years. In fact, fighting has been a part of hockey since the sport's origins in the 1800s. Over time, there have been rules to try and mitigate the violence on the ice, such as the NHL implementing a 5-minute penalty to players who fight in 1922, or the more recent instigator rule, which gives an extra penalty and game misconduct to a player who instigates a fight with an unwilling combatant. Still, players today are allowed to engage in some good old-fashioned fisticuffs. Typically, the players most likely to engage in a fight are known as enforcers or goons. These are usually bigger, slower, and less skilled players on the team that have one role: beat up players on the other team if and when necessary. Goons enforce the code. They are pretty much the police of the game. Some of the most popular enforcers over the years include Bob Probert, Dave the Hammer Schultz, Marty McSorley. Players like Tom Wilson and Ryan Reeves have taken the symbolic torch from the old guard. While some of these players might chip in some offense here and there, they are really just relied on to protect their teammates and ensure that the code is adhered to. There was a time in hockey that fighting was even used as a strategy to win. Look no further than the Philadelphia Flyers of the 1970s. Dave Schultz, Bobby Clarke, and Bob Hound Kelly were just a few of the notorious Flyers that physically imposed their way to back-to-back Stanley Cups. These Flyers were intimidating as they were skillful. Not only would they be able to score a bunch of goals on you, but they were also extremely intimidating to the point where other teams were simply overwhelmed. So much so that in an exhibition match with the Russian Red Army team in 1976, the Russians went back to their locker room in the middle of the game to protest the Flyers' physical play. Another reason fighting is allowed in hockey is the player's desire to shift the tide or momentum of the game. When a team is down a few goals, they are limited in options. Some coaches select to switch out their goalie and put in their backup. Other times, a player on the losing team will go and fight someone on the other team in an attempt to boost his team's morale. A great example of this came in the 2009 Stanley Cup playoffs. In a heated first-round matchup between the Pittsburgh Penguins and the Philadelphia Flyers, the Penguins were trailing 3-0. Up 3-2 in the series and looking to avoid a Game 7, the Penguins needed a spark. So, in comes Max Talbot. A beloved player during his time in Pittsburgh, the forward initiated a fight with Flyers forward Dan Carcillo. Talbot lost the fight pretty badly, But after the fight, he took his finger and essentially shushed the Flyers crowd. The Penguins players were ready to run through a friggin' wall after that and rallied to score 5 straight goals to win the game and the series, along with marching their way to a Stanley Cup victory a couple of months later. And who can forget the pure entertainment value of fighting in hockey? When it comes to understanding why fighting is allowed in hockey, it's hard to overlook how well fighting sells. The NHL has taken steps to try to protect its players, especially considering the high occurrence of concussions and other injuries its players deal with. But they still let players fight because the NHL is well aware of just how insanely entertaining a fight can be. For instance, you know how there are goalies? Those guys that wear the really clunky gear and pads and try to keep the puck out of the net? Well, they fight too. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. It's awesome. For your sake, take a second and go and watch some old clips of goalie fights. Patrick Waugh, Chris Osgood, Ray Emery. There are some absolute gems out there, and you won't regret watching those fights. And how about the infamous shoe incident in 1979? Shoe incident? But I thought hockey players wear skates with steel blades in them. Well, you'd be right to think like that. Except there was this one game in 1979 between the Boston Bruins and New York Rangers. The game devolved into an absolute bloodbath, and Mike Milbury of the Bruins went berserk against a Rangers fan and rushed up into the stands of Madison Square Garden, then proceeded to beat that fan up with his own shoe. Classic rivalries in the NHL were built on fighting and violence. The Montreal Canadiens and the Boston Bruins, Colorado Avalanche and Detroit Red Wings, Philadelphia Flyers and Pittsburgh Penguins, New York Rangers and New York Islanders, just to name a few. These rivalries are well known for devolving into violence and featuring wild fights. And this isn't unique to the game of the 70s or 80s. It still happens today. Just in the 2022 playoffs, we saw a matchup between the Edmonton Oilers and the Calgary Flames that featured plenty of fighting and was hyped up by fans as an old-time hockey series. There just isn't a price on this kind of stuff in hockey. Is it extremely dangerous and barbaric? Yeah, but it's also awesome. And that's a big reason why fighting in hockey isn't going anywhere anytime soon, especially in the NHL. There are some hockey leagues that have and will continue to take action in trying to prevent combat in their matches. At the collegiate, junior, and even some pro levels, leagues have tinkered with their rules to discourage players from fighting and even in some instances, outright banning it. However, when it comes to the NHL and most other hockey leagues, it's hard to see fighting not being a part of the game. The code will continue being passed down by the players. Players will continue using fighting as a tactic to intimidate the opposition and shift momentum in games. And of course, most leagues are not going to do anything to something that has essentially become synonymous with hockey to most fans around the world. Good old-fashioned rock'em sock'em fisticuffs. There is no doubting that the modern hockey game has shifted to one featuring more speed and skill than grit and will. But fighting has and always will be an essential part of the game. Thank you for watching, and make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. And be sure to leave a comment down below about your thoughts on fighting in ice hockey.